So, Elie, here we are. It is, we should say it's at the beginning of this week, just coming off of a weekend where we had at least 24 cities where there were tens of arrests. And there were mass protests across the country, some of which at varying levels became involved, damage to property, but also a considerable amount of violence. And frankly, the vast majority of that violence perpetrated by police officers. I mean, the irony of people protesting police violence and, broadly speaking anyways, and being met with police violence, I guess, it feels like it hasn't been lost on the country on some level. But give me your, I guess, let's start at the 20,000 feet view of really just, I guess, the past week.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of peak 2020, right, for police to be brutal at protests where people are protesting police brutality. It's you can't write that script. I look, that the 20,000 feet issue is that there has been a history of police brutality in this country that goes back, pick a date, like 1691, 1786, pick a date. There's a history of police brutality that goes back in this country, and nothing ever seems to change to stop it. You can kind of get into the internet thing, like battles, like who wants what and what are they really protesting for. What people are protesting for, the ones who are protesting, is for the police to stop killing us. We want them to stop killing us. We want them to stop beating us. We want them to stop treating us differently than any other American citizen. And I think that these protests, what we've seen in the past week, they can't be understood without thinking about what we saw over the last month, right? Yes, George Floyd's death, horrible death, is an instigator, is a flashpoint. Yes, Ahmaud Arbery's lynching is a flashpoint. In Louisville, the death of Breonna Taylor is a flashpoint. But you have to remember that everybody sitting here in this country has been watching the same news reports for a month. And we all saw predominantly white protesters with guns and Confederate flags going out there and protesting right in the cops' faces over, not being able to get a haircut and not being able to go to the bar, right? We all saw that, and we all saw the restraint that the police exhibited. We all saw that, protesters are pushing police into lakes and nobody's getting shot, nobody's getting pepper sprayed. We saw amazing restraint by the police for white protesters. And so when then you flip it around and you're out there not protesting whether or not you can get a haircut, but whether or not you can walk peaceably in your neighborhood without being harassed by the police, to then be confronted with police in riot gear, who are throwing tear gas canisters and shooting rubber bullets, like that is the milieu. That is the context under which some of these protests are boiling over and some of the anger is boiling over. We know the police can do better because we just saw them do better.
Right. I think that's a great point. The people can make the comparison, but it's also what it says about the capacity for police to actually deal with these type of protests. And certainly, I mean, I have that vision of, I guess it was out in California, of where the protesters were getting right into the face of these police officers and screaming at them and shoving them. And the cops are just looking there. They've got a complete poker face compared to a lot of what we saw around the country where you had cops just almost aggressively trying to start something. And I think that's where we see that type of violence, or we see that kind of like the attacks on property. But we should also, I think it's also important to keep in mind that we also have a situation, this ongoing pandemic, where not only has it generally put people on edge, but we also have a disparate number of Black people who are dying and getting infected from COVID-19. And it is one more example of both a class divide, but also a racial divide and disparity in society.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Sam, because one of the things with this pandemic that we've seen is unequal policing, right? I saw a stat earlier this week, right before I saw the video of like the day that I saw the video of George Floyd. The beginning of that day, I was on a conference call about a new lawsuit that's being filed against NYPD for racial profiling during COVID-19. It turns out, based on the stats that we have, that so far in New York City, 81% of the summonses for violations of social distancing orders have been against black and brown people in New York City. Now, let me tell you, I don't know what you might have heard, if you live in Montana, but New York City is not 81% black and brown. Right? It is almost impossible to come up with that number of 81% of summonses against black and brown people without kind of intentional racial bias in social distancing policing. So when you talk about the fact that we've been under kind of, we're all on edge because of the virus, because of the pandemic, because of the, social isolation, you also have to kind of put into this context that the unequal policing and the racially biased policing, that never stopped. That didn't take a break for 3 months while we were all hiding from the disease. Like the oppression that the police are willing to put on black and brown people and on black and brown communities never goes to sleep, never lets up. And that's part of what is the anger from that is part of what is boiling over this summer.
It's remarkably consistent, despite the fact that it's a completely different context, right? I mean, 3 months ago, the idea of policing people's social distancing did not really, well, I mean, I guess it's arguable, stop and frisk on some level. You're in a group of, but as a genre of citation did not exist, and the idea, there's many things I think that are being laid bare when society is under duress, right? As the tide recedes, it's quite clear, who's beached and whose boat remains afloat on some level, and we're seeing that across the board.
And we're seeing the pain and anger that comes out of that, right? Like that's an integral part of how to understand what we're seeing on the news and the pictures and the fires that we're seeing. There is a lot of anger that comes out of that disparate, unequal treatment for so long.
Let's talk about. I mean, like I said, we're talking at the beginning of the week, and one of the things before I get there, is it your sense that when we see what we've seen on TV, right? We've got police departments set on fire. We have a couple of police vans. We have a significant amount of property destruction. Apparently in Minneapolis, there's a really significant amount. I think, certainly, I think there is some reason to believe that some of these instances are a function of people who are not really protesting with these protesters, but are rather trying to make it appear that the protesters are more violent than they are. But I think there's also a significant number of folks who are protesting who it's simply a reflection of their anger. And I don't think strategically necessarily this is the best thing to do in this situation necessarily, but I also it seems to me to be completely understandable under the circumstances that you would get this type of reaction, particularly in the way that the police in Minneapolis initially reacted to it. But is it your sense that there is that I don't, look, it's very difficult to get a sense of what's happening in the suburbs versus, in rural areas versus the cities. But broadly speaking, is it your sense that there is more sympathy or empathy for those engaged in protesting and those engaged in expressions of anger than we've seen in past instances?
I think that's a really good question, actually. I think there is more understanding of what is happening and why from white liberals than usual. Usually, once a fire starts, once the brick goes through the window of the AutoZone, that's usually when you lose many otherwise liberal white people, right? That's usually when you lose, the kind of moderate, centrist, law and order suburban women who swing back and forth between Democrat and Republican, depending on who they want to have a beer with. Like, that's when you usually lose those people, and I don't perceive, from where I sit and, Twitter and Instagram and whatever, I don't perceive us losing those people right now. I perceive that people are a little bit more understanding of why it's happening. I'll give you another example. I wrote a post about, not defending the violence, but explaining the violence, explaining the protests, explaining like why sometimes these protests do turn to vandalism or violence or whatever. I wrote a very similar post when I was much less well-known after Ferguson. And the hate mail I got after Ferguson was just like, oh my goodness! It was like I had, called for, it was like I was the one calling for property destruction and damage, right? The hate mail that I've gotten after this one, not as much. I mean, some, but not nearly of the same level of vitriol, right? So I think that's another, at least, kind of anecdotal indication that on the white liberal side, there is a little bit more kind of understanding of what's happening. On the white conservative side, I mean, they're doing their thing. Right. And I think we live in a bifurcated society. We live in two Americas, and what the MAGA people are sharing and interpreting and saying, that's they're in their own world over there.
All right. Well, two things. One, let me just say, in terms of the AutoZone, you use that as an example. I mean, obviously, there's a lot more there that's indicative of a lot of sort of the smashing of windows. But the AutoZone in particular, there's some very strange video out there of an individual actually smashed those windows. People can find it, and there's reporting that's ongoing there where they're trying to figure out who that individual might be. It was a white guy with a black umbrella in a black trench coat, wearing a face, a gas mask, and was acting. It was a very strange way to go about that type of activity. Let's put it that way. But putting that aside, I just felt like I needed to mention that because I know there's people out there who saw that video who are like, wait a second. But nevertheless, the point remains. But I mean, since you brought up too the right's going to do their thing, I find it really interesting. I mean, we hear a lot of calls. The line from the right, and I call this from like my watching Fox and Friends, Lord help me, and other right wing talkers, and the president himself, and his representation, because the president really hasn't said anything, frankly. But they have been. There's two things that strike me. One is they're talking about peaceful protest is one thing. You can respect that. Of course, all of these same outlets, including the president, spent weeks, probably months, slamming Colin Kaepernick for exactly that. For the most peaceful, protest you could actually do. They spent slamming him. But they are not talking about this in terms of race. They are talking about this as if they are saying this is Antifa, as opposed to this is Black Lives Matter. And I'm curious as to why you think that might be. Is it just simply the election is coming up?
I think it's simply the election is coming up. I think that there is they feel like they get more steam here, making this a Democrat-Republican thing, making this a liberal-conservative thing, making this a law and order versus anarchy thing. Then they feel like they pick up more steam making it one of those things as opposed to a racial justice thing, in part for two reasons. One, they already got all the racists, right? Like they don't need to emphasize the racial disparity here to convince on-the-fence racists whether or not to vote for Trump, right? Like they got them. And B, they're not going to pick up any more white people by just talking about the racial injustice or pretending that the racial injustice doesn't exist, because everybody saw the video. The actions are so. For George Floyd, at least, the actions are so beyond indefensible that there are no votes to be gained defending the cop who murdered George Floyd. Right? There are votes to be gained again in the suburbs, in these white bedroom communities. There are votes to be gained by making white people afraid that the rioters could be coming for you. And the best way to do that right now, I think they are perceiving, is to try to blame it on, to basically make us Venezuela, right? To blame it on socialists or Antifa or whatever. I mean, Antifa isn't whatever made-up word they come up with next. Like that, they feel like there's more votes to be made there.
Yeah, people are calling. I saw some of the right-wing talkers calling for the legal decapitation of Antifa, and I'm just wondering, like, who would they arrest? I've covered every just about every protest on some level. I've talked about on one of my shows that involved Antifa, and I could not name who you would decapitate, what that would constitute. And so I can't imagine they could either. But I want to just raise one other incident that took place over the past couple of weeks, actually past month, that we haven't talked about, that I think I wonder what your take is in terms of it changing slightly the attitude in the way that the elasticity of the tolerance for these type of protests, where in the past, I think you're right that there have been a certain segment of the center or center left or center right that was less tolerant of this, was the incident in Central Park with I believe her name was Amy Cooper, and I cannot remember.
Yes.
And I can't remember what his name was, but Amy Cooper was. Yes, and he is a bird watcher, and he was going into the Ramble, I think it's called, in the Central Park, which is apparently an area that is specifically for bird watching, and they have specific rules about putting a leash on your on your dog, and she was in there without a leash on her dog. He came and said, "Would you please?" Put a leash on that dog, and she really, really, really resented him saying that, apparently, to her, and began to actively threaten and then actually call the police and say, "There's an African-American man attacking me." And she signaled to him, "That's what I'm going to do." And she said, "I'm going to call and say there's an African-American man attacking me." It got to the point where she started stepping towards him, and he was the one who said, "Please don't come any closer," as he's videotaping. But it was basically she's saying to this man, "I know the disparity in policing in this society. I know that the threat of me calling the police, even when you've done absolutely nothing wrong, and I am the one who is, making an infraction, as it were, the threat to you is that much more, extensive, dangerous, and real. And I'm telling you now, I'm going to do it." And then I did it, and it basically was. We were sort of watching Emmett Till's story on some level.
We were.
And good.
I think where Amy Cooper plays in, and Central Park Karen, as she's been derisively called, I think where that plays into what we've been seeing this week is that I want to say all the time, but a lot of the time, the kind of center-left, center-right types of people that we're talking about like to pretend, like to say, "Oh, I'm colorblind. Oh, I don't see race. Oh, race doesn't matter. Oh, we just need to live in a race-neutral society. Oh, we're living in a race-neutral." Like, they say all these platitudes that are meant to suggest that they do not understand and do not accept that the inherent bias in our society, the inherent bias in our policing, the inherent racism that black people face every day. Amy Cooper happens right before the killings, right before the video of the police murder. And what that reminds people is that y'all can't lie. Y'all know this. You know in your heart, Amy Cooper knew in her heart what the threat of calling the cops meant to a black man like Chris Cooper, right? There's no denying that she knew what could happen to Chris Cooper, because it is the threat of because what could happen to Chris Cooper constituted the threat that was involved, right? And so when you see an Amy Cooper video, as we all saw, again, just days before George Floyd was murdered, what it takes away is this argument that was always false, that centrists and moderates like to pretend that somehow we are living in a post-racial society, that somehow we should or are ready to move beyond race as a factor. We all know that's not true, and Amy Cooper kind of doesn't let them lie now. For a brief moment in time, Amy Cooper kind of took away their ability to lie about that just before they knee George Floyd to death.
And I want to just get to one other thing in just a moment. But lastly, do you think that this is starting to aggregate? For many, many years, there were these claims, and I think in many respects, Rodney King was one of these sort of, breakthrough events where it was hey, maybe this is real, that black people are talking about, and that with the advent of cell phones, we have been had, I imagine the number of these incidents has certainly not gone up, right? I mean, I think these have been going on for decades, like you say, in one form or another, since the founding of this country. But we have cell phones now. They are ubiquitous, and we are seeing more of this. And it's almost like, you didn't believe us before? How about this? And how about this? And how about this? And how about this? And on and on and on. And at one point, you see 30 of these, 40 of these, and suddenly you're like, I guess it's real. I mean, do you think we're at maybe that inflection point?
No, unfortunately.
Right.
No, I thought we might be there after Eric Garner, who was choked out in broad daylight on video, and nothing happened. Nothing changed. Nothing changed in New York City. It took us 5 years to fire the officer.
Right.
The reason why the reason why I'm cynical and depressed about our ability to change is that recognizing that racism is real is really that's a real low bar. That is not nearly enough to get change. To effectuate change, you need people to not only kind of accept that racism is real in an ongoing fashion, beyond the next week and a half, and change their actual behaviors, right? Change their voting patterns, change what they're looking for in candidates like district attorneys and mayors, change their criteria for appointing judges, have the judges change their criteria for issuing search warrants. And, it's a systemic problem, and you need white people for the most part, because this is still a majority white country. It's very hard to do anything without a majority of white people in this country. You need a majority of white people to maintain that focus on this problem going forward for long periods of time, and there just hasn't been a lot of evidence that white people can kind of attach and dig in and hang in there for the length of time that we would need them to focus on this in order to get changes.
Elie, you are the nation's justice correspondent, and so I would be remiss at this point if I did not ask you, even though I don't think that we have heard quite yet from the Supreme Court. But today, early this week, obviously, from when I think people are going to be hearing this, the Supreme Court was scheduled to decide on what, if any, of, I think, double-digit number of cases. Maybe it's 10 or 12 or 13 cases that could be a means in which to revisit the concept of qualified immunity. Qualified immunity was basically a legal doctrine developed by the Supreme Court in 1982 or 83, I think it was, that basically said that there has to be that government officials, including police officers, have immunity unless the specific thing they have done has been found to be a violation, I guess, a statutory or a constitutional violation. Is that right? I mean, will you explain that concept to us and give me your sense of like what the implications of this are?
You basically explained it exactly right. That officers of the state, which include police officers, have immunity from civil liability for pretty much anything they do within the line of duty. You know, there are a couple of exceptions for when they clearly go outside the line of duty, but like making an arrest would be something in the line of duty. And if they commit crimes in the line of duty, like making an arrest, they are generally immune from any kind of further liability or damages for those actions. It is, as you said, it's been around since the mid-'80s. It is, I think, important to say that this is an immunity that has been consistently upheld not just by conservative judges, but by liberal justices and judges. This is a rare. Both sides are kind of equally bad on this issue, and it is one of the core reasons why cops feel they can brutalize and sometimes murder people with impunity. They know they will never be charged civilly, right? So, like, if you're a cop and you're trying to decide whether or not you should break this guy's jaw or not, when you know that guy can't sue you, can't take your house, can't take your car, can't take your livelihood away, you're just much more likely to break his jaw. That's just how you're going. If you're already inclined to break the man's jaw, there's nothing left to stop you. You're not worried about any accountability for your actions. It's something that we need to change, but to change, you need to, first we have to get liberals to understand that it needs to, conservatives, that's the master class. We need to get liberals to understand that this needs to change. And they are very resistant
What
to
is
change
the theory? What is the theory that
you don't want cops. You don't want them to second guess themselves. That's been the theory since for as long as I've been aware of the thing. That's what's always been told me, that somehow in the line of duty, under the heat of the action, you can't risk a cop second guessing themselves. They have to be able to act in the way that they see fit. And that, to me, it's ridiculous because, again, as a black man, no, I want the cop to second guess himself.
I was just going to say. Is there anything that sums up exactly what people want? Is the cops to, in some way, and the interesting thing is that it's almost like society has been trying to push against a string. In other words, like we can go in and say you've got to take implicit bias training, when in fact a lot of the times the issue is explicit bias. But what we need is accountability for these police officers so that they are coming in and saying, we need training so that we can stay within the parameters that we now know are ones that we should not cross.
We need that. We need to break the thin blue line stuff is such a problem that I think we kind of gloss over it. Like, we need cops willing to call out other cops. Not, first of all, we need them certainly in situations like now, and you are actually seeing some cops finally say, like, man, that video seems wrong. But we need cops to call out other cops in real time. If you look at the George Floyd video, there were 4 cops there. Any one of them could have said, take your knee off that man, but none of them did. Right? It's like that is a key part of the problem. I say joke. I'm only half joking. I think that there are some situations where the entire damn department should be charged with RICO, right? Which charge under racketeer, the organizational crime statutes that we have, because in some of these departments, every member of the department is part of the conspiracy to continue and cover up brutality. we have to find a way to break that, that solidarity amongst cops where they won't stand up for what's right if a fellow cop is doing what's wrong.
Elie Mystal, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Stay safe, and
Thanks for having me on. I'm
thanks.
still quarantining, man. I'm still still trying not to get COVID.
Well, we can we'll check back in soon. I have a feeling many of us will be doing the same for a while. But thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam.